when Polaris was announced back in 2016, there was much rejoicing. A new generation of cards is always something to be excited about, but there was something about this launch that was, at least for its time, more exciting than most. Which was sort of strange given that Polaris wasn't the biggest or fastest card for its time. It wasn't even AMD's flagship product. Why it was so exciting will soon become evident in this video. There was a period, long ago, when AMD and Nvidia leapfrogged each other every 9 months or so, ferociously outperforming and undercutting each other every generation, almost without fail. If you bought a new PC, you could guarantee that within about 6 months you could have got something better for less. But one thing led to another and Nvidia slowly got the upper hand, and with it, prices started to creep up. This was noticeable with the 900 series. At that point, AMD's 290 series of cards were still powerful enough to come close in terms of performance, but consumed a lot more power in the process. At the ultra high end, AMD's Fury cards couldn't quite beat the flagship 980 Ti, but they got close enough to be okay, given that the price was right. But with the release of Nvidia's 1000 series, there was no longer anything AMD could do. They were outclassed in pretty much every way. And with more than a year to go before their competing high-end Vega cards were ready to launch, Polaris was the only thing they had to tide things over with. It's not like they had much choice in the matter, but how they marketed these cards was quite unusual and very effective. Just so you know, before Polaris, that is the Radeon 480, people weren't too interested in the 80 tier of cards, which normally just provided previous gen high-end performance, but at a lower price point. Normally, with a new generation of cards, the faster 90 tier would come out first, everybody would get excited for them, and then the 80 tier would come out soon after for everybody who couldn't quite afford the fastest cards. A second best, if you will. In fact, both companies did this. The fastest product took centre stage, and those below them were an afterthought. But this all changed with Polaris. Finally, it was the mid-range tier's time to shine, as the Radeon 480 took centre stage. It finally looked as though AMD was going to be able to match Nvidia on power efficiency again. It was fast enough to meet the requirements for VR, and it was priced at just $199. It seemed to be everything. This was an exciting moment for gamers. It might not have been flagship performance, but it was fast enough. Before this point, you had to make serious compromises if you only had $200 to spend on a graphics card. But with this card, it was good, affordable, and finally ended a period of price-performance stagnation, sending prices tumbling in the mid-range and making the $200 price point the sweet spot again. And for all those gamers who were chugging along on ancient hardware, this was the card that was within their price range, and that appeared to sport enough power to handle modern games well for the foreseeable future. That's what we need right now. A $200 graphics card hero to make PC gaming affordable again. As the go-to card for budget gamers, for people building second rigs, or for competitive gamers, gaming at low resolutions. This card would support new features like ray tracing and intelligent upscaling. A feature like DLSS, which improves performance with minimal hit visual clarity, would be more useful in a $200 card than it is in a more expensive one, but ray tracing would also be nice. Hear me out here, it doesn't need to run it well. I don't expect it to run well. That's what more expensive cards are for. But down at the $200 price point, it would just be nice to have the option of ray tracing if I wanted it, just to see what the fuss is about, even if it is at sub 30 FPS. And also to know that this $200 graphics card isn't artificially rendered obsolete the moment games begin to demand ray tracing. Don't tell me how to play my games. If I want to play it at 360p with ray tracing and DLSS, then I should be able to. And while I'm making demands, I'd like for this card to be available at $200, and not out of stock everywhere. This seems like an unreasonable ask in 2021, but that's why we need a $200 hero card now more than ever. I don't think AMD quite understood the significance of what they did with Polaris. They showed benchmarks where 2 Radeon 480s matched the GeForce 1080. Anybody who knew about dual GPU setups took this with a pinch of salt. Nobody bothers with 2 slower cards over 1 faster one. There are just too many downsides to it. With just one, the Radeon 480 wasn't even particularly fast. It's at pretty much where you expected a new 80 tier would, roughly matching AMD's previous generation 90 tier of card, and landing somewhere between the previous generation GeForce 970 and 980 cards. But I don't think this mattered to consumers, when it was so attractively priced. Plus, this was all just from an 80 tier of card. If this was what AMD's new mid-range could do, how awesome would the 90 tier of Polaris be when it finally came out? With hindsight, it wasn't so sweet. there wasn't to be a 90 tier until the next generation, and even then it wasn't much more than an overclocked 80 card. After Polaris was out, prices stagnated again for some time. So long in fact that I know people who wished they had bought the GeForce 1080 instead of the Radeon 480, had they known how long the price performance curve was to remain static, and that they'd be stuck on the same card for so long. But there's no way anybody could have known this at the time. In 2016, the Radeon 480 was THE card to get, and the 470, which I also liked. As was the competing GeForce 1060, released the month after, which ended up selling far better than AMD's cards did. Since 2016, there hasn't been much good news for budget gamers. If you have $200 to spend today, you'll still not get much better than what it would have got you 5 years ago, and that's depressing. Your best bet these days would be the GeForce 1650 Super, which is about the same speed as the GeForce 1060 was, or the 1660 Super, which is about as fast as a GeForce 1070. But even that's a tough sell for owners of Polaris or a 1060, especially since these cards already lack current features like ray tracing and DLSS. Indeed, since 2016, the $200 price point offerings have paled in comparison to those in the $300 range and above, even from a value perspective. Since then, the prices have only increased, and the price performance curve has remained so static that I can't even see where the mid-range is anymore. So instead of trying to identify the mid-range, let's instead look for what it represented, which was the sweet spot for price to performance. So where is this sweet spot these days? Given the 3060's specs and how it isn't out yet, right now I'd say the price performance king has got to be the GeForce 3060 Ti. It's not a lot slower than the more expensive 3070, it has the same ray tracing and DLSS features as the more expensive cards do, and it soundly beats almost everything released before that generation of cards. But the 3060 Ti isn't $200, it's $400, and even more given that the supply of the card is so limited right now. In other words, if you want the sweet spot today, then you'll have to spend at least twice as much as you did with Polaris. And I understand that things are different these days. A new graphics card will last you longer than it would have done 10-15 years ago. There are more graphics settings and resolutions than ever to dial back if you need more performance. We're also expecting higher frame rates than before. I remember playing Doom 3 at about 30 FPS back in the day and thinking, this is okay. And of course there has been inflation since then too. And shrinking down to smaller nodes gets more difficult and costly every time too. But in my mind, what the world wants is a good $200 card again. It doesn't need to provide flagship performance, just performance that's good enough. A product that you can use and to not feel like you're missing out. I feel like, at least in terms of upcoming hardware, this year is the best chance in a long time we've got of seeing this happen. The $200 price point used to be the domain of the 60 tier of GeForce cards, but since even the standard 3060 has been announced at $330, I guess we'll have to look to the GeForce 3050 series to provide a $200 option. It might be like how the 1660 series was, but with RTX support, which would close the gap between it and the higher end cards. The killer feature would be DLSS, which is an intelligent upscaler, effectively combining the high frame rate of a low resolution with the image quality of a higher one. At the high end it's mostly used to make ray tracing run acceptably, but at the low end it could be used to massively boost frame rates in games in general, being what's needed to push demanding titles over the 60 FPS mark and competitive games to 144. I've already tested it out at ultra low resolutions and it's crazy how coherent the image still looks, even when running games as low as 480 or even 360p. You can check the video out here. The problem right now is that very few games support DLSS. You can't just enable it in any game you want, and the technology is Nvidia's. AMD doesn't have something comparable to DLSS, yet, but they have mentioned it in passing, though the 6000 series came and went and it still isn't anywhere to be seen. It's obviously coming. Consoles using AMD hardware have used similar tricks to reach high resolutions for years. Microsoft's got something called DirectML that games should soon begin adopting. And it's got to be coming because DLSS is too good to ignore. With AMD's new RDNA 2 cards, they do at least have ray tracing support, and hardware that can scale up to the high end. The question is, how far down will they scale with this? Come to think of it, it isn't just graphics cards that have stagnated, is it? The processor market has seen the same thing. The Ryzen 1000 and 2000 series had appealing products in the $100 to $200 price range. The 3000 series was faster, but below the $200 Ryzen 3 600, there seemed to be extremely limited supply for whatever reason. And now with the 5000 series of cards, AMD hasn't even bothered going down below $300 yet. It's like, if you want to build a budget gaming rig, you can either choose to have second-hand components, or nothing at all. And this isn't helped by product shortages. I've never seen anything like it. Products released months ago are still unavailable, and any that are released are immediately snapped up and reposted on eBay at well above their asking price by scalpers. It's a nightmare scenario for anybody needing new hardware. I can't believe I did this, but to a friend who wanted to play Cyberpunk who was unable to get a graphics card, I suggested streaming the game via a service such as Stadia. Streaming. If you want to own your own hardware, the only sensible option right now is to weather the hardware drought out and to wait for stocks to fill and for prices to hopefully return to normal again. Though where normal will be after all this is anybody's guess. Part of me thinks there isn't any returning from where we are. Now we've seen that there are so many people willing to spend $500, $600 on a graphics card, there's not so much incentive to make a cheaper product now, is there? But part of me hopes for a new $200 hero card. So what's going to end the mid-range drought this time? Maybe, once demand for the new consoles has gone down and chip production is ramped up, we might begin to see existing graphics cards returning back to the prices they should have been at launch. Maybe then we'll see some sort of mid-generation price war as the mid-range cards from AMD and Nvidia start to be released later this year. This is what I think will happen, and will result in the slowest and least exciting price drops imaginable. If history repeats itself, the cards we're looking for might still be 2 years away. I've been following this stuff for a long time, and if you want a PC to last for as long as possible, it needs to be able to run the latest generation of console games. The cheapest way of doing this would be to buy a new console the moment it's released, but on the PC side of things, the best time to buy is several years later. The Radeon 4850 was one of the best $200 cards ever. It came out 2 years after the PlayStation 3 was first released, and it was able to power games until the PlayStation 4 came out. Less than 3 years after that console was released, out came the $200 Radeon 480 card, which has been a capable card right up until the PlayStation 5 games started coming out. Things have changed a lot since the PlayStation 4 era, but it will be interesting to see how good $200 cards at the start of 2023 will be. Maybe a sweet spot could be managed below $200 in the form of an APU. I loved the Ryzen 2200G that I bought a few years ago. This was a CPU-GPU combo for less than £100. I can only imagine how great it would be now if given the latest generation of hardware. A Zen 3 CPU with RDNA 2 graphics cores could be an awesome combination. Sure, you wouldn't expect great gaming performance, but it could be enough to tide people over, provided they were happy with lower resolutions, frame rates and graphics settings. Or maybe a $200 hero product will come from a third company. Intel have been rather quiet recently, but they've been working on their own graphics cards, which we might start to see in the next year or so. Perhaps in a bid to gain market share and some goodwill, they'll offer some attractively priced products around the $200 price point. We'll just have to wait and see. But until one of these things happens, we'll just have to sit tight and to think back to happier times. Polaris's impact hasn't been forgotten. I've noticed a recent trend that AMD or Nvidia will spend more time talking about their second or third fastest card, before briefly showing their fastest product at the end as some kind of Halo product. I wonder if this is a vague tribute to the success of that Polaris demonstration from 2016, or simply because Halo products these days are so damn expensive.